Today we welcome testimony from a distinguished panel of witnesses. First we have Tim Mohin, who is the Chief Executive for the Global Reporting Initiative. Second, we have James Andrus, who is an investment manager focusing on sustainable investments for the California Public Employees Retirement System, or CalPERS. Mr. Mohin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I thank the subcommittee for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. My name is Tim Mohin. I'm Chief Executive of the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. We are the largest standard setter for environmental, social, and governance, the so-called ESG information. Prior to GRI, I've held senior roles at 3 different major American companies. I also have experience in both the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. federal government. So I speak to you today not just as the head of the world's largest ESG standard setter, but as an individual who understands the complexities and pressures faced by American companies and also the importance of strong federal policy. Today I'll focus my remarks on the ESG Disclosure and Simplification Act. GRI welcomes this legislation. It will strengthen ESG reporting by companies and it will protect investors. And specifically, the bill will level the playing field for both companies and investors. It relies on international standards, and by doing so, it will not increase reporting burden because the vast majority of companies are already reporting, and they're already reporting to the GRI standards. And it will protect investors by creating essential, clear, and comparable data. Let me just share some brief background on GRI to explain why we support this legislation. We were established in the United States by Ceres, who's represented on the panel today, and we became an independent organization in 1997, over 20 years ago. Our success over 20 years is really based on the old axiom that you manage what you measure. All organizations, including the ones I previously worked for, run on data. And by identifying, measuring, and most importantly, reporting ESG topics, you tend to improve performance on these topics. And this is not just some theory. I have seen this firsthand in the companies that I've worked for. 2 of my former employers, Intel and AMD, have actually been reporting ESG information for over 20 years. For these leaders, it's not just about accountability with investors outside the company. This information is a very important decision tool inside the company. We created the GRI standards to provide the tools needed for companies to collect and report ESG information. But over the years, we have continuously improved these tools. Perhaps the most significant change we've made in the last few years was to completely revamp our governance model to become the world's only independent, international, multi-stakeholder standard setter for ESG information. And we did that by modeling our governance model on the same governance that the financial standard setters have. And largely as a result of this process, we are now the most adopted ESG standard by both companies and policymakers. Today, more than 90% of the largest 250 companies on the planet are reporting ESG information, and 75% of those are using the GRI standards. Here in the U.S., the number is about 600 companies using the GRI standards and about 80% of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Globally, the market for this information is exploding. We had some information last year that the assets being managed with some form of ESG information are now over $30 trillion US, and that's larger than the GDP of the United States. And it's grown by 34% in the last 2 years. It's growing because investors know that so-called non-financial information can have significant financial impacts over the longer term. And policymakers around the world have not missed this trend. They're following this trend. We are tracking right now 139 policies in 61 countries that specifically reference or require the GRI standards. 60 of those policies in 45 countries are capital market regulations. So just like financial disclosure, it's essential that this committee and policymakers around the world focus on a single global standard because we need a common global language if we are going to unlock free trade and capital flows that increasingly depend on this information. So in conclusion, I want to applaud the committee for the ESG Disclosure and Simplification Act. It will protect investors, it will help unlock free trade, and ultimately, it will help align capital to sustainable business practices. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today.
Mr. Mohan, do you think the SEC could effectively build on the great work that your organization has done in establishing ESG metrics for companies to disclose? Mike?
Yes, I do. And in my testimony, I made a point about why that's important. As investment flows and capital flows increasingly rely on this information, it's important to have international standards. So if we draw a parallel to the financial standards, a few decades ago, it was more sort of a patchwork system. And as we had the International Financial Reporting System and the FASB come together, now we have basically one system, and it has unlocked free trade. So it's very important to look at a single global language, and to do that, you really have to focus on an independent, international, multi-stakeholder standard setter like GRI.
Could SEC standards essentially complement your organization's standards?
What I would recommend is that SEC, like they have done with FASB, refer to an independent standard setter like GRI. That way you get the state of the art, it stays up to date.
But I do want to get back to the issue of the destruction of shareholder value. Mr. Mohan, I heard here that, in fact, these disclosures will destroy shareholder value. It sounds to me that's just the opposite. Studies point the other way, do they not?
They absolutely do, and I wanted to thank Congressman Vargas for this legislation. It's fantastic legislation because, you know, these issues, climate change, human rights, ethics, diversity, environment, health, and safety, these are critical issues. And, you know, if they were disclosed in an orderly fashion, then I think investors and companies would have far more information to make these all-important decisions. If, in fact, they were included in the financial definition of materiality, we might not have these massive issues that we're facing today. So it's very, very important to level the playing field. And if you look at what's happening in the world today, with the majority of companies, all the big companies reporting using the GRI standards, it's obvious the trend line here. Companies are seeing it's important. Investors are asking for the information. So it's already happening. I think what's important for this subcommittee is to level the playing field so that we don't have those companies that are kind of lying in the weeds and not stepping up and reporting.
Can you help us understand, if we were to adopt these rules tomorrow, do companies need to reinvent the wheel for how to actually go through and calculate these risks, or is through the good work that GRI and WRI and others have done, are the templates largely in place at this point?
The templates are largely in place, Congressman, and they continue to evolve and grow as the megatrends of having this information go from sort of more the reputational space into the global capital markets. The disclosures have become much more professionalized and the taxonomy standardized.
Some of you might say if you properly take those into account, you would get the same discounted cash flows across the board. I'm just curious, all of you are involved in some level in the investment sector, and you just go down the line. You know, does your firm currently employ ESG in their investing practices? Yes or no?
Thank you, Congressman. We're a standard setter, so that wouldn't apply to GRI.
This is all about disclosure. The gentlelady from California wanted to ask Mr. Atkins that, so how much?
I believe my remuneration is publicly available in our annual report.
So, no, what is it?
It ranges each year, depending on...
What was it last year?
250.
Mr. Andrews? When we talk about things that should be disclosed, are there some harmful activities that you think should be disclosed to the public? So in the banking sector, if banks bank certain industries, should that be disclosed?
Thank you for the question. Sir, we are a standard setter, so our role is to create the world's best standards using multi-stakeholder
Standards for
input.
banks. Should banks disclose who they bank?
The disclosure based on our standards is really a matter for companies and the regulators of those companies. So we set the standards, Others choose to use them
we
or
want to
not.
know if you invest in, you know, a gun manufacturer or a gun retailer, is that something you think the public should know?
Again, sir, our disclosure
Do you think we should know that?
as a standard setter, it's not something that we
Or
take a
about
position
whether you
on.
invest in abortion clinics or THC, or whether you support the American flag, or whether you'll bank detention centers? Are those things that you think are important for the public to know?
Actually, it's quite an interesting question because our independent standard setting board actually chooses which standards go through that process. And none of the issues that you just mentioned have actually made it through that process. And so by employing the world's experts on terms of what is a sustainability issue, none of those has actually gotten through. To the point that Mr. Huizinga made, some of these these issues do bubble to the
So
top.
on the social side, what do you want disclosed on the social side?
Well, we actually have our disclosure standards. We have 33 topic-specific standards.
Give me a couple. What are your favorites?
Human rights, ethics, environment, health and safety, some of the basics.
So on the environment side, who sets the environmental standard? You guys do? You set the priorities?
No, we don't set the standards. The experts, we have subject matter experts from
Set the standards
industry.
on what you should do on your environmental standards. So you have your experts internally.
Not
Well, how-
internally, no, sir.
Externally.
They come from industry. They come from civil society.
How
they
are you
come-
funded?
Pardon?
How are you funded?
We have sources of funding that are 70% self-funded and 30% from
So
grants.
if you look at the political spectrum on who funds you, are they down the middle of the road, no political persuasion, left, right? Who funds you?
Of the 30% that's grant funding, it's majority government. So we have fundings from government that actually cite our standards in their legislation.
I would note that